Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Yarnflakes Podcast. My name is Audrey. I am a knitwear designer from the southwest of France, and this is a Knitty Yarny podcast where I talk about all of my knitting creations. So, hi, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me for this new episode. I hope you're doing very well. I hope you are appreciating the fact that I'm probably the worst lighted podcast on YouTube. It's an artistic choice, okay? Let's go with that. I have a little episode for you this time. I have 3 things that I would like to share with you. One is a new design, which is a 1 skein fingering weight shawl. One is a finished object, the sweater I'm wearing, and I would also like to share with you a new work in progress, a new shawl that I started designing. So, yay! Gonna start. You can find timestamps to all the different sections of the podcast in the description down below. So if you want to skip anything or look for a project in particular, feel free to look at that. I also put links to everything that I talk about, the patterns and the yarns I will mention, as well as my social media and my links for my... I'm not doing that sentence right. It's going wrong. Let's restart. Links to everything that I talk about, the patterns and the yarns that I'm mentioning, as well as links to my social media, my patterns, which are for sale on Ravelry, Payhip and Lovecrafts, as well as my Patreon page, which you can have a look into if you would like to support my work in exchange for some behind-the-scenes content. But I am going to start with a new design that I just released on Ravelry, and this is a shawl that you have seen a long time ago on Instagram, because this is a shawl that I knitted last summer. I went into holiday with 3 skeins of yarn, thinking that I would make a 3 skein shawl design. Actually, the shawl that I designed, which was the Zelkova shawl, which is already available, only required 2 in the end, and so I was left with 1 skein of yarn and 1 week of holiday and nothing to knit. So I decided to try a 1 skein shawl. I already have a pattern for a 1 skein shawl, which was released a while ago, but it's a crescent shape shawl, and so I wanted to try something a little bit different. And so here is the Quilisma shawl, which is an asymmetrical triangle, which you start knitting here at the tip with a I-cord and garter border and garter stitch here at the edge, which increases slowly. You increase 1 stitch every 4 rows, which means that the shape of the shawl is very fine and long, which is something that I find really useful whenever you're making mini shawls with only 1 skein of fingering weight yarn. I find it's much better to make a long shawl. This way you have a decent wingspan, even though you're only using a small amount of yarn. And so we have this lace motif, which is not particularly complicated. You do need to be comfortable reading charts. The pattern is charted only. There are several charts for each portion of the shawl. Like, the entire instructions are charted, so you only need to go from one chart to the next, and once you've started, basically. And yeah, there are also some wrong side lace here. Basically, you have to do some eyelets and decreases, but it's very intuitive because, as you can see, it creates those lines. So basically, when you're on the wrong side, you see your eyelet and you're like, okay, I need to make the eyelet next to that. So this can be a really nice way to, if you've done some lace before and you would like to get into more complex projects, you could start with something like this, because it requires you to make some lace on the wrong side, but it's still fairly intuitive. So it's a nice intermediate step, basically, between the simple lace that is only on the right side and more complex designs. You also have some simple centered decrease here, and this little cable running along with the bubbles, which you don't have to make if you don't like bubbles. I believe one of my testers did the shawl without the bubbles. Those are my bubbles that I always make. Basically, they're made all at once in one go. It's a Japanese technique, basically, that is initially done with a crochet hook. But when I learned to do those bubbles, I didn't see the use for the crochet hook, because you can just do the same with the needles. And I don't like using accessory things. So yeah, there is a video tutorial in the pattern to show you how to make those bubbles. And they're very easy, and they don't require you to go back and forth and turn your work, which I find is a bit troublesome when you have to do this. But yeah, you continue with this lace until some point where you start slowly implementing some garter stitch. And then basically you can continue until you run out of yarn. So I recommend that you have 400 meters, that is 437 yards, I think, of yarn. So when I say one skein of fingering weight, avoid the ones that are only 360 meters, 400 yards. Although, like I said, basically at this point you repeat a chart and you can stop wherever in the chart. It doesn't matter. So if you have less yarn, you can stop before, but it might make a shawl that's too small, in my opinion. So 400 meter at least, and then up to however many you want if you want a longer shawl. And it's really easy to adjust. Basically, I finished mine with a stretchy bind off because it uses less yarn, and that way you can knit until you really are left with just enough to bind off. The yarn I used is John Albon Textiles Knit by Numbers, which I've already talked about it. I really like. I really like for lace because it has a really good definition still, but it has that little fuzziness, and it's so soft, and it comes in so many lovely colors. If you don't know, Knit by Numbers is a Falkland merino, if I'm not mistaken, and basically you have a color, a bunch of different colors, and each of them is available in different saturation levels, basically. So you have gradients of each possible shades, which makes a total of a lot of possible colors. And I really, really enjoy it for shawls because it's soft. So, yay. I hope you like it. As far as wearing it, so you can wear it normally because thanks to the elongated shape, it's long enough to just be positioned, if I can, normally. But what I like to do, what I prefer to do with smaller shawls like this, is actually take the two ends and make a knot, and then hide that knot under the bulk of the shawl. And you can have the point of the triangle either at the front if you don't mind the bib look, on the sides, and it just makes a nice little thing that stays in place. So, but it's still a light shawl, more for spring, and yay. So I hope you like it. I wanted to make a one skein shawl, another one which had a bit more of a motif, because the Riala shawl, which I made 3 years ago, which is a crescent shape shawl, and it can also be knitted only with 400 meters of fingering weight yarn. It's a garter stitch shawl with the small lace border, and I wanted to make a shawl that was more heavily intricate, with bubbles, which are quite yarn consuming, and it still works. So, yay. There is a little promotion for the release on Ravelry, so if you would like it, there is 15% off until Sunday with the code KILI on Ravelry, just KILI. Did I say the shawl's name is Quilisma? I don't think I've said it, I don't know. But yeah, and it's also available as usual on PayHip, and it will be on Lovecraft in a couple of days after you've seen this podcast if you watched it just at the beginning. Yeah, so there it is. I hope you enjoy it, and off with the self-advertisement. I'm going to move on to a finished personal project, which is the sweater that I'm wearing, which you have seen. I have shared the process of it in several different podcasts. This is the 7th sweater by Megan Babin, and it is completed. And so if you have seen my previous podcast, you may remember that I had a bit of a fright with the sizing and my gauge, because I am using a yarn that was new to me, which is Katia Merino Dal, which was gifted to me by the brand so I could try it out. And it is this pure merino dal, so French merino, not necessarily French, but like that race of sheep. And it is superwash. And basically, superwash yarns tends to spread a bit more, but at varying degrees. And since I've never tried this yarn before, I didn't know how much it would spread. And so I did swatch. And the thing is, when you make a big project for the first time with a yarn, I still have some apprehension not knowing how the yarn will behave, and if my final project gauge will indeed match my swatch gauge, because I personally don't like making swatches, and so for a swatch to be faithful in this context, basically I would have needed to make an entire front and that's a bit silly to me. Like, I didn't want to do this. So I had a little moment where I wasn't sure that my sweater will block like my swatch did. I was afraid it wouldn't stretch as much. Actually, it ends up being on point with what I was expecting, so that's great. The yarn didn't stretch at all. I was quite surprised at this because it's a big, heavy jumper. It's a superwash yarn. It's cables, which tend to spread a lot as well. And the yarn didn't stretch out that much, so that's a really good point, and I'm really happy with the yarn for that. It was pleasant to knit with. It's very nice and bouncy and soft. I didn't have any knots issues in the 11 balls of yarns that I used. So as far as the knitting and blocking experience go, I'm really satisfied with the yarn. And overall, I did use less yarn than I thought I would. So if I had purchased the yarns myself, it would have cost 76 euros. Last time I talked about this, I said it would be about 96 euros. So it's only 76 euros, which is better. For the price of that yarn, because it's not an expensive yarn, a ball is 6 euros for 50 grams, 100 meters. And yeah, the fact that it's a big sweater with cables requires a lot of yarn, so it is what makes it a bit more expensive, right? And I'm very happy with it so far. So I will be wearing the sweater as much as possible. It is still quite cold here nowadays, so I think I will still have some occasions to wear it. So hopefully in a few months I will be able to give some feedback on how it wears out, because that's kind of the most important thing, right? When you make a big sweater. You don't want it to peel instantly and to not hold its shape. So in case I forget to give some feedback on the yarn after it has actually been worn, remind me. But yeah, so far I'm really happy with it. And yes, that's it. As far as the pattern goes, I want to give some final thoughts, because I've had some questions of people who wanted to knit the pattern as well as, and wanted to know what I thought in terms of difficulty and how it was. It's accessible. It's really well explained. The thing is, it sort of stands in between. It's one of those patterns that, in terms of instruction, is not 100% hand-holding. So if you need to have your hand held at all times, and if you're someone who needs to have instructions that perfectly, if you need to apply the instructions like as they are, and if it doesn't work, you're going to have issues with that. And I know some people are like this, and you just can't deal with that. That's totally normal. Then that would be a problem, I think, because the cables are not what's complicated. I know you look at it and you think the cables are what's complicated. It is not. The cables, these ones, which you have on the sleeves, are very intuitive. And after you knit one sleeve, basically, you understand the motif, because this one you need to cross to make a certain cross every right side row, and you can just trace back to see where you need to go. Those cables are the types of cables where you have one stitch in the center, so you need to cross. It's like a 5-stitch cable, so you need to cross two, and have one per stitch in the center. So you need to be comfortable with that. You need to know cables, have done some of them in the past, but in terms of the motifs themselves, they're very easy to remember. So basically, since the sweater is knitted flat, you make one sleeve, and then these cables, they're fine. So when you're on the body, you just need to focus on the big cable, which is this one that you see in the center, which this one you can't really learn by heart. It's like 48 rows, it's big. It has some crosses here and here, which are like really pretty, but they're not necessarily intuitive. So you need to follow the chart for this one. There's smocks here. But, well, you only need to follow this one, because these ones, I think, are easy to remember. And this one you only do 3 times. I did it 3.5 times in the back. And yeah. So even though it looks big and intricate, it's simple crosses. The most complex cross is the one that I explained to you, this one. These are like simple 4-stitch, 6-stitch cables. You'll be fine. And in 3 stitches as well. And that's, I think if you've already done some cables and you understand how cabling works, you're fine. The point where I think people who prefer to have their hands held will have an issue with is regarding construction, because even though it's a pretty simple construction, again, it's knitted flat. So you need to be a bit more at ease with your gauge, with the size you choose, and with seaming itself. You are seaming, these are a mix of a saddle, shoulder, raglan sleeve, and you are seaming along a slip stitch edge. I think I didn't seam really well, because when I look at the pictures of the sweater, you can still see in between the slip stitch one of the garter stitch. Personally, I preferred to, when I did my seaming, I just seamed where it seemed the easiest for me, basically. So that was in between the garter stitch and the slip stitch, which you can see here, because I chose not to seam the hem, because even though I have enough, the size is large enough for my hips. When I went down here, I decided, well, you know what, might as well keep the hem split, because I like that. As you can see here, there's a garter stitch and then the slip stitch. And so basically I seamed right in between them. So that's why my seams are just the slip stitches, which I think looks nice. So it's straight seams. So you need to be a bit comfortable. You need to know what size you are and be okay with not being able to try on the sweater, etc. And the thing is that you have to do the shaping and the cables at the same time. So, for example, the pattern says you do the cables and you do a decrease for the raglan every 6 rows or something. So you need to figure out a way for you to keep track of that. It's not necessarily complicated, but you need to make out your own system where you remember to make the decreases. What I like to do is I usually make an Excel spreadsheet thing, and I figure out the total number of rows. For example, if the pattern says decrease every fourth row 5 more times, I know that's 20 rows total, and every fourth row I make a little cross on my Excel sheet, and basically every time I make a row, I just go down one line on my spreadsheet sheet, so that when that's a difficult distinction to make. And whenever I see that I've marked, here is the decrease, I make the decrease. You can also just count the rows on your knitting if you can do that. And so that's not necessarily complicated, but I know that that's a thing that some people don't like, having to handle themselves. When you're on the neckline here, so you technically have to do 3 things: the cables, the raglan decrease, and the neckline decrease. However, like I said, these cables, they're intuitive. You bound off the complicated one. So you also quickly start not to make those cables. So you end up only having to really deal with the 2 decreases. Now, what I mean by sometimes the instructions don't add up is that depending on your row gauge and on the size that you're making, sometimes it doesn't work as instructed. And that's not an issue. I don't think it's a mistake or anything. It's just that the pattern is exhaustive enough. I mean, it's not exhaustive. Exhaustive. That's not a word in English. What am I talking about? Is it? I mean, complete, but as in fully complete. The pattern is clear enough. It's very clear and very expensive in all instructions. Except there are some areas where it's possible that your own knitting will not work. For example, since my row gauge is tighter than the patterns, also in the pattern I didn't see the row gauge for the cables. I only saw the row gauge for the reverse stockinette, which is a bit weird, though I understand, because who gets the right row gauge anyway? No one. But since my row gauge was shorter, basically when I started binding off for the neckline and decreasing here, I already had done a lot of the raglan decreases. So here, just here at the tip, the pattern told me to do decreases on the raglan, decreases on the neck for a certain number of times until I was done with the total raglan length, and I should have been left with 4 stitches at the end. The thing is, it wasn't working. Basically, if I was following the types of decreases and the rate at which the pattern told me to do it, I would have finished way quicker and I wouldn't have had 4 stitches left. So I had to fiddle myself with it. Just change the rate of decreases and change the type of decreases that I would do so that I would end up with the final 4 stitches that I could bind off right here. So you see, this is the type of things that you kind of have to be independent and figure out on your own. And you know, it's not complicated, but I know sometimes it just is not something that you're comfortable doing, and it will just be a pure block for you. Another example is here at the saddle shoulder. So as you can see, the cable continues completely until the saddle shoulder. If I followed the instructions for the last decreases here, I would have broken my cable. So I understood that the goal was to keep the cable. So I changed it so that I could have the cable being right. So yeah, basically the pattern tells you how to do something, and it tells you what you need to achieve. And sometimes it doesn't quite add up and you need to make small adjustments because of your row gauge, because you did something with your size and with the number of stitches that you have. And it's not complicated again, but you need to be a bit more aware of how things work and how to fix something if the instructions cannot be followed word by word. So yeah, I think that's the point where most people would have issues with the pattern. It's not complicated because of the cables. It's not really, I mean, a lot of people, they think a design is complicated because it has a motif on it. It's like the number of people who think that my designs are complex because I use lace or cables or something. And I'm like, no. Well, of course, it's more complicated than just making stockinette, obviously. But there is such a big range after that of patterns that assume a lot more knowledge on your part. And this is sort of in between. Like, it's totally well explained and a bit more explained than it ought to be for such a big and complex pattern with multiple sizing. You have varying shaping options as well that are fully written out. And yeah, it's a lot. And but there are some things where if you're making such a piece, you should be able to have some wiggle room and adapt things yourself. Yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to say. Let me know if you have any questions. Maybe I forgot some really obvious things to mention regarding the pattern, but it was super enjoyable to knit. It always had a rhythm. And as far as the neckline goes, it's folded. And I didn't... so when you make a folded neckline, what you can do is you can fold it over and bind off as you attach it. I didn't do that because my big head... which is actually not very big. I have a rather small head. Wouldn't fit. So what I did is that I cut off a piece of yarn, I thread it through a tapestry needle, and I just whip stitch it to the back here so that it would stay loose. I hope it's gonna not sag after a while. I'll see. Another thing is that I should see after I have worn the sweater. But yes, I'm very, very happy with the result. Oh, last thing. Do pick a size that has enough ease, because the armhole is quite low and mine is not that low because, again, my row gauge is shorter. But as you can see, my armpit is here. And so there's it's a loose armhole, which makes sense because it's a loose sweater. But if you don't have as much ease, I personally don't understand how people like to have tight sweater, tight sleeves with the low armholes, because it makes weird folds and also it removes my arms mobility, basically. So yeah, make sure that you do pick a size and work at the right gauge to have enough ease, because if not, the armhole would bother you. The armhole is about the same or exactly the same, I don't remember, depth for every size, which means that for the largest size, well, armhole depth shouldn't increase proportionally with the width of a bust, the circumference of a bust, but it's still it still needs to be a bit longer for larger sizes. For larger sizes, you don't have that much of a difference, but for medium and small sizes, the armhole is quite low compared to the typical one that you would do. And so you can, if you want, shorten it, again, by making it by wiggling with the decreases. Like if the pattern tells you to decrease every 6th row, you can change that and decrease every 4th or 2nd row. You would have to just figure out the actual length that you want, make it match your row gauge, and adjust the decreases accordingly, and make it on the body and the sleeves the same. So that's completely doable. But I just wanted to attract your attention on it, in case you know that that's something you wouldn't like, having a low armhole. It's possible to change, but yeah, it's not a problem if it's big and cozy. So yeah, I think I've said everything. Like I said, let me know if you have any questions and if I forgot. I am really happy. I'm really impressed with how fun it was to knit. Like, it's well thought out, because you always do something fun with the pattern, and it's well explained, and it still leaves some space for you. Like, what I mean by sometimes the pattern don't work, it's just that it leaves some space for you to adjust, and it's easy to do so because you know exactly what you need to do, and that's really well explained, and that's great. So yeah, I really enjoyed knitting it, and I'm really, really happy with my classic cream jumper. I need to take pictures of it, but it's very gloomy here at the moment, and the light is terrible, as you can tell. So I'm waiting for a sunnier day so I can take some pictures of it. Yeah, that's it for this big sweater, and I'm going to move on to a new work in progress, which I wanted to show you, which is a shawl. A new shawl design that I'm working on, which is most likely going to be released in June. And it is a triangular shawl. And it's a triangular shawl that is knit top down with more increases on the sides. So, well, it's a bit difficult to show because it's on 80 centimeter needle, but it already has, I think, more than 400 stitches at this moment. Because basically I'm increasing 2 stitches here, so more stitches on the edges than on the center. This way it's not going to be so deep. I personally like a deep shawl, but I just like to vary shapes, you know, and I think a lot of people don't really like triangular shawls because they're too deep and not wide enough. So that is why I make that change. This fixes that. And yeah, so what I'm doing is a mistake rib. There are several motifs that look alike, basically that's sort of slightly raised ribbing. One of them is actually seed stitch in between, one of them is slip stitches. I saw one of them that looked like it was knit one below. The one I choose to knit is a knit 2 purl 2, basically, that is offset. So you have one line of knit that is always knit, one line of purl that is always purl, and then in between it's like one row knit, one row purl. So basically, if you look at the chart, it does this. And I chose to do this one because it's big and it's a long thing to knit and it takes time. I just wanted a meditative, easy project that I could knit on while I was reading or watching shows. I started watching... I'm slowly entering the rabbit hole of Korean dramas, so I really need to watch the subtitles. So I need to knit something that is not requiring too much attention. If you have any Korean drama recommendations, please. Korean or any show, really. I'm back into watching show mood. I chose the knit 2 purl 2 because it's very clear why when I make a mistake, basically, because I know that this knit needs to stay knit. And so if I'm offsetting myself, I'm doing knit 2 purl 2, but I know it shouldn't stack with the knit 2 purl 2 of before. So if I see that it starts starting to actually make a 2x2 rib, or that I have a purl in the middle of my knit column, I see it quickly, basically, and so I can unravel the few stitches I just did wrong. And that was something that I wanted to be sure of because it's a big piece of ribbing, it's long to knit, and so I wanted to make sure that it stayed fun and meditative and like a mindless knit that you could work on without worrying too much. And this required for me to be able to spot if you make a mistake really quickly. And this way was the most intuitive for me. And yeah, the second thing that I decided to do was work in intarsia so that I have one side of the shawl in one color. The more I'm knitting on this shawl and the more I'm designing the next steps, I really think it would look really fun as a one color shawl, as a monochrome thing. So yeah, when I'm going to call for testers, I will see if anyone wants to make it just as one color. You could also just make it as one color, and then I'm gonna have a lace border with this color, which is a lovely gold. And I haven't decided yet what kind of lace it will be. I've spent 2 weeks working on design submissions for magazines, and some of them are lace, and I basically, when you come up with a design idea, you need to make a swatch to show the magazine. And so I as I was trying out different lace motif, basically you have the final motif that I want to use in the design submission, but then I have like all those intermediate steps, all the other motifs that I tried until I completely changed it until it's the resulting one. And some of those intermediate motifs that I charted, I kind of want to see if they wouldn't work for this. So most likely it's going to be a lace border at the end. So yeah, you could do this part in one color and then the border in lace. So yeah. Intarsia, very simple. I like to cross, because you need to, Intarsia is making different color blocks. It's knitted flat. If you knit it in a round, you must do short rows, so knit flat. You make one color, you change color, you go, and then you go back, you change color, you go. You need to twist your strands like once, so that you actually attach the pieces. I like to do it only once. Some people like to do it every row. It depends what you think looks good with your tension. But yeah, basically this is how the join looks right now when it's unblocked. I do it on the right side rows. Basically on the right side rows I cross, and on the wrong side rows I just leave them be. So yeah, really fun to knit. I am using yarn from Les Petites Potions, which is a French indie dyer, which I talk about a lot. I promise she's not paying me. A while ago, she made some color combos of this base, and basically I saw this combo and I absolutely adored it, so I asked her if she would dye one for me. I don't remember if I paid these yarns. It's complicated with Les Petites Potions. We exchange a lot of yarn and designs, and so I don't remember which I paid and which I didn't pay. But this is her Linalka base, which is a blend of alpaca, linen, and silk. And I absolutely love it. It's quite fine. So it's a fingering weight, but it's quite fine. And since it's like alpaca, silk, and drape, which is, alpaca, silk, and linen, which is just a recipe for a huge amount of drapes, drapiness, and like just flowy things. I am knitting it rather tight. I'm using 3mm needles, which for me, for a shawl, is rather tight. I prefer to do this when I'm using yarns that I know will drape a lot. I don't want them to be too sloggy. And since I'm making a texture, I want it to still retain its bounciness a bit. So that's why I'm knitting it on such small needles. I'll probably make a note in the pattern to adjust that in case you're knitting with a regular yarn. The gauges should match up anyway. By regular yarn, I mean a yarn that is not that drapey. So I'm knitting it tightly, and it's so great. I think it's one of my favorite yarns ever that I've tried for a shawl, because it's so light and drapey, and at the same time it's squishy. It keeps the squishiness of the texture so well, and it has a really nice definition. It's really, really nice. And you have the little heathered bits of the linen that poke out, and it's soft, but it has that natural feel. I am really impressed with this yarn. I absolutely love it. I think it's great for shawls. And I can't wait to block it and see it fully and see how it works with the lace. I'm pretty sure it's gonna be very nice as well, because it has a really nice definition and it's airy and it's great. It's great. So I think I'm going to stop this section soon. I don't know. Listen, I've wanted to stop it about 10 times because it's a short repeat. It's like 8 rows that I repeat. It's reversible, by the way. This part at least is. It's a 8 rows repeat. Storm. Flipping. Oh god. It's pouring quite heavily. It's 8 rows, and basically every time I reach the end of those 8 rows repeat, after this 8 row repeat, I'm like, okay, now I can stop. But I've always been at that moment in the middle of an episode of a show or in the middle of a book and something, and so I'm like, no, okay, no, I'm going to continue. And I've done that about 10 times, and it's just really nice and meditative. It takes a while, but I enjoyed it, and so I don't know. I also want to use as much of my yarns as possible. I will still reuse those colors at the end a bit, mixing it with the lace in gold. But yeah, I'll see. But I should be done with this first section soon, I think. So yeah, that's it for the shawl, which I'm looking forward to continuing to seeing how it, what kind of lace I can incorporate after. So yeah, that's it for this episode. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I will see you soon in a couple of weeks, I think. And yeah, thank you so much. Have a lovely rest of the day, evening, day, whichever applies to you. And I will see you next time. Bye!